perspective, I want to bring in Congressman Mike Turner of Ohio, who sits on the House Armed Services and Oversight Committees, and also newly elected president of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. Congressman, thank you so much for joining us. And, you know, that last point by Phil, I think, is what is a concern for many Republicans, is that he's putting in place another yes man.
Ash Carter is not a yes man. I've worked with him. He certainly, as you were just stating, understands the Pentagon, so he really has deep knowledge.
Thinker.
Right. He certainly understands the national security threats that we have. But the problem is going to be, as it has with the other secretaries of defense, the White House can say the chain of command is clear, but the policy isn't clear. Unless the president looks to his national security team, which is going to include the Secretary of Defense, and formulates a policy to deal with Russia, Ukraine, ISIS, Libya even still, as it's fallen into disarray, we're still going to have a Department of Defense and our national security struggling.
We are. So what are you looking then from Ash Carter to do? I mean, how do you expect him then to be able to outline this policy?
Well, he's going to have to push the White House, because it's the White House that has obviously been reported as micromanaging the Department of Defense. And to the extent where, the president even today will not acknowledge that Russia has invaded Ukraine. I mean, that's just a basic understanding or acknowledgement of what the world is like. As the White House says,
the president has acknowledged it.
He has not acknowledged. The words invasion, we've actually called, myself and the chairman of the Armed Services Committee, called on the White House and questioned their pursuing false narratives with respect to Russia, and unwillingness to even acknowledge that an invasion has occurred. Those false narratives.
But the reaction to Russia has been pretty tough, right? I mean, there have been sanctions. I mean, we're undermining the economics of Russia given this.
Well, they have not been. As you know, Poroshenko himself, the president of Ukraine, came in a joint session of Congress and said, I can't win this war with blankets. I need aid and assistance in both houses. Unusually, bills have been dropped calling for greater aid and military assistance to Ukraine. So Ash Carter's got a tough job. He's got a White House that claims that they're in the chain of command with undefined policies. They're pursuing false narratives, and they need to come to grips with what the real threats are and let Ash Carter do his job.
But see, that's what I mean, is that how is it going to be any different with Ash Carter then? It wasn't any different with the 4 other defense secretaries that preceded him.
Well, if he looks to the time that Hagel was there, Hagel certainly had opinions that were different than the White House. He was not as aggressive as perhaps I or others would want him to be. Ash Carter has a known record on these issues, and hopefully he will push the White House forward and work on the national security issues that are real threats to us today.
Do you think he's going to have any problem being confirmed by the Senate?
I don't think so. He's had a stellar career, and certainly both in the Senate and the House. As I said, I've worked with him. He's worked with a number of people on important issues. Great record of making, the Pentagon work. He's, having been at number 2, as the Department of Defense Secretary, he's going to know how all of the people underneath him need to do their jobs and execute, the to-do list that they're facing.
It's a long, long to-do list. Now, I want to switch because it is Jobs Day, Congressman. And speaking about defense, I mean, the Defense Department itself, we're looking at the numbers of the people employed by the Defense Department. They're the largest employer in the United States, 3.2 million. And then right below that, you have, of course, Walmart and IBM and other major private employers. But it makes me think about yesterday, for instance, when the House passed this new defense budget bill, right? And it cut some benefits to the military. Increased a little bit more aid, though, to some of the hot spots that you just talked about, fighting Islamic State, Syria. Do those cuts, though, that were passed by the House, do they go deep enough, or should there be more? At this point, I think we're going to see increased spending in the Department of Defense. We're in this 2-year period of 2014 and 2015 where sequestration was abated. The president had brought forth a 10-year plan that had massive cuts to the Department of Defense, cuts that Ash Carter has been a great public critic of. So as he takes the helm of the Department of Defense, he's going to have to look to the White House to get support for ending sequestration, increasing spending in defense to be able to respond to the force that can respond to the threats that he now sees. Increasing spending, though, how is that going to happen at a time when we're talking about austerity and cutting back on spending? Well, what has happened is that 50% of the overall cuts that have been undertaken applied to 18% of the budget, which is the Department of Defense. What we need to do is we look to decrease overall federal spending. We need to look to other areas in the budget for cuts and look back to restoring some of the cuts that really have affected our readiness with our military.
For cuts, well, I think really all across the board we need to look for cuts. No one wants increased deficits. They want spending that's smart and that goes to the issues of protecting our national security and certainly our important programs. But the sequestration policy that has been pursued by this president has really affected not only morale, but the readiness of our military.
And just on a final note, Congressman, your new role at NATO, which is a very powerful and expansive role. Tell me a little bit about what's going to be the first on your agenda, working with other parliaments around the world.
Well, NATO is our strongest allied arrangement and relationship, and certainly they have joined us in some of the most important threats that we see with ISIS, Afghanistan, and certainly the issue of Ukraine. We just recently had a meeting of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, and the voices were unified, and those voices were increased military spending. All of the countries were calling for, reinvesting back into our military, that our cuts have gone too far, recognizing that Russia is an aggressor state, that we can no longer pursue the false narrative that they, can be an allied friend, that they now are a force that threatens Europe. And understanding that ISIS must be destroyed and stopped, or the Middle East is going to be destabilized.
All right, Congressman, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. Congressman Mike Turner.